now we've looked at the juken, we've looked at the sword early on. Perhaps we can now switch to later in Ueshiba's life.
Yeah.
And I'm going to show you footage that starts basically the videos we have started about 52. Unfortunately, we don't have much in between, but we've had quite a lot after that.
Okay. At this point, he was using a iaido Bokken, or it was?
Yeah, it looks very thin, right?
Yeah, it's just
like Imano, this like this really looks very like iaido.
It does, right?
Again, it looks like a mixture of things.
Oh, for sure.
And the thing that we don't have the sound, so we can't tell you whether he was telling the other guy, okay, go, or strike, or give instructions, which is...
Because the other guy doesn't look very good, right?
No.
Well, he's a guy with a stick.
Yeah. But you say it's Tamura, right?
Yes.
Yeah, there was plenty of judoka and then people from other jujutsu styles, but not that much. Not so much
Sword people.
Not so much.
I see.
Which one? Ouch. This one doesn't look anywhere near as good as the later one. Yeah.
Not in Osaka. Tamura would have been probably far more used to do weapons with him. Osaka, I don't know who it is, I can't tell, but that could be somebody from Osaka who was not necessarily as used to it.
Maybe it's because it seems to be a much more enclosed space, not so much room. So the Maui is very close. Yeah. For the other one, it was a lot more fluid, a lot more sort of, I don't know, expansive, I guess you could say. Now, what I like about this, compared to the stuff he was doing before on his own, whacking away with the sword there, he's actually got an opponent with him this time. And from a perspective of kendo, you can actually see exactly what he's doing. Baptiste mentioned before he doesn't know if he's, because we don't have the sound, if he's, sort of signaling the guy or telling him to do this or do that. But what I see is from a kendo perspective is like he is really controlling.
He's connecting.
He's not breaking that connection, and he is actually sort of enticing his opponent to come in, and then he's just completely in control of the distance. And it's really, really quite beautiful to watch, actually. Now whether this is effective swordsmanship or not, I don't really think that's significant at all. I think what he's doing here is he's really, in a way, like a conductor. He's controlling his opponent's movements, making him do what he wants him to do, and you can see that he is, compared to this earlier stuff, he's so much more relaxed. We talk about the three sens. Sen no sen, and go no sen. Where he's just taking the initiative the whole time and striking when the opponent's thinking of striking, or making your opponent strike and striking just as he's thinking, as he's halfway through it or when he's finished. Looking at what he's doing, this is precisely what would be happening if I was fighting in kendo with somebody who is known as 60s or 70s or 80s, who's a hachidan sensei, who's obviously a lot slower than I am in terms of speed, a lot weaker in terms of physical strength. But when you go up against these guys, it's like, what the hell? It's like you just buy into their bullshit, and then they just pick you off one by one as you're going, and so that's why it's so amazing fighting these old guys, because you can't hit them, and you're up against them. You think, if I go now, he's going to strike my door or something. But if I don't go now, he's going to hit me, and it's like, get out of my head, get out of my head. Just watching him there, I mean, it's as convincing. If he was a kendo master with Borgu on doing exactly the same thing, it'd be totally believable. So the principles are exactly the same. The only difference is, and looking at his earlier ones when he did have an opponent, it was just always so close. The Maui was unnatural. But looking at what's happening here, not so much on this one because I think it's quite a close space, but one before that, the Maui was to perfection. So the principles are essentially the same. The hardest thing, depending on what sort of weapon you're using, is to be able to gauge that Maui, that distance, to perfection. And this compared to what he was doing in the 30s and in those earlier videos, this is actually quite impressive.
And you can also tell that the footwork is way more, it's synchronized, it connects.
Totally. Yeah,
it's not messy at all. It's very sharp.
Yeah,
he moves when he needs to move.
Yeah, it's
like in the 30s, it's like he's jumping around like it's like a kid in the backyard with a stick somehow. But here it's like
Did you just call UESHIBA Sensei a backyard ninja? Oh my god!
No, I did. I mean, but like on this video, I mean, this makes this is good. Well, everybody has to start somewhere, so a backyard is a good place to start.
So there is definitely a contrast, right? Certainly much more skillful display.
Yeah.
Now, what's very interesting for an Aikidoka is that we are often told that if you want to do good Aikido, you need to do good weapons. And you can't basically, some people argue that you can't understand Aikido if you don't do weapons. Now, what we see here is that in the 1930s, Ueshiba Morihei was definitely not as proficient as he seems to be now in the mid-50s. Yet, he was extremely proficient in his taijutsu. He already had his Kyoju diary. He was very well known for his taijutsu. So I find difficult to believe that the weapons would have been a prerequisite to reach that high level of taijutsu. Because if we look at this, it seems that he became better at weapons later in his life and after he mastered taijutsu. I'm not saying that there is no link at all, but it doesn't seem that it's a deal breaker.
Well, I mean, I wonder, it's a very simple observation, but I mean, isn't the premise for, be it Daitoryu or Aiki Jujutsu or Jujutsu itself, is that you are engaged with an enemy who may or may not be armed with a weapon, right? So whether you have one or not is irrelevant. Your opponent, let's say, has one, and if that is the case, which is what a lot of these taijutsu arts are premised on, right? Doesn't it stand to reason that you should also have an understanding on how to use weapons so that you are better equipped to deal with a person who is using a weapon?
Exactly, which is not for the weapon itself, but for your ability to make use of whatever environment you have. So you could have a frying pan, and that would be a weapon, and you would use it efficiently. Your use of your body would make sense. And regarding your point about the conditions being the person being armed or not, or you being armed. Now, in the Daitoryu curriculum, at the very, very basic level, you have that. It's very easy to see. For example, when you're in Hanza Handachi Waza, you're on your knees, and somebody will grab your hand, your wrist, either the right one or the left one. And in the kata, you're not supposed to do the same technique, because if they grab the right one, they will be pulling towards themselves and then hit you to prevent you to go and get your sword. If they grab the left one, they will push so that you can't take back your saya. And therefore, your response, the technique you will do in response to that will be different because the attack is different. So there is a strong link with weapons, having a weapon, not having a weapon, and so on. But this is not a weapons technique per se, which has been derived into taijutsu, and which is, I think, a misunderstanding that is pretty widespread.
Well, maybe I can turn the question around.
I was about to say the same.
Yeah, it's like you do hear. Actually, I have a close friend who is now Hachidan in Kendo, and Hachidan is the highest rank that you can attain, and it's pretty hard, and it's like 0.7% pass rate, out of thousands of people that attempt it, and he was also a practitioner of Aiki Jiu-Jitsu, Daitoryu actually, and he attributes his success in Kendo because of his experience in taijutsu, in that, again, it's like just using the weapon all the time, as you do in Kendo, but suddenly to have a different kind of perspective. Again, becoming accustomed to fighting from various Maai, and also the ability to somehow deflect the power of an attack from somebody is perfectly transferable into Kendo. And what I'm seeing here is the opposite. And Ueshiba Morihei is using his skills in Aiki Jiu-Jitsu, or Aikido, whatever you like to call it, depending on the time, obviously. He's transferring it directly into... He's doing exactly the same thing, he's just doing it from a different distance with a big extension of his body. So to say that if you want to get good at Aikido, you should know how to use weapons, I think you could say if you want to get good at Kendo, it's really useful to be familiar or skilled in taijutsu as well. So I certainly think that I don't think it's a prerequisite, but it certainly wouldn't hurt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One question the other, and when you're trying to get better at something, being questioned about what you're doing is kind of mandatory to move forward in your research. So it sounds kind of obvious to me. Just to set the context, nowadays Jiu-Jitsu are more popular than Kenjutsu or Kendo, in the sense if you add Judo, Aikido, Karate-Do, well, almost all budo are, but some form of Jiu-Jitsu or Kenpo. What was this relation like 100 years ago? That like swords were far more popular than Jiu-Jitsu, or the Judo was already popular enough to like counterbalance that? The question is, with this context, we can also imagine the environment, the budo environment in which Ueshiba were raised, and if you, in the case Jiu-Jitsu was not very popular, maybe he turned to weapons because it was more noble to practice weapons.
There was certainly an element of almost snobbery in the Meiji period with regard to Jiu-Jitsu, which was considered quite a ruffian's martial art, in that it was for scrappers. It was for criminals and bad eggs who go and fight each other. And so actually, and in fact, that's one of the reasons that Kano Jigoro, and it's well documented, he didn't want to call his school of Jiu-Jitsu. He wanted to call it Judo, to avoid that kind of the bad connotations with Jiu-Jitsu. Kendo obviously has the fact that we're using a sword, has a visibly direct link with samurai culture. So it did have a more noble image to it. And that Kendo you can't use in a fight anyway. I mean, nobody carries swords around anymore. They shouldn't do. But it had a different kind of symbolism attached to it. Kendo was never really supposed to be practical in that sense. And so possibly, I mean, when he was growing up, he probably would have, for anybody who was interested in the traditional martial arts, the most prominent martial art at the time, even today, I think Kendo has more practitioners than any other martial art in Japan.
That's for sure.
And it does have a different kind of symbolism attached to it. So for sure, his opportunities to do any kind of martial art probably would have gravitated around Kendo.
What's interesting when you read an interview of Ueshiba Morihei that he did in which is published in the first book about Aikido, which is about 42 as well, I think.
Not the third, first book.
The book called Aikido. In that interview, he describes to the journalist a little bit about his background. Now, some of the terms that he uses is they're confusing because he doesn't say the full name of the school. So, but anyway, one thing he does go out of his way to say the name of a school, and often saying, "But by the way, I did mostly the jujutsu," or by the way, I did only the beginning level. And what transpires, or my interpretation from that interview, when I went back to the actual Japanese text to make sure, because it was not clear from the translation that were made, and really does try to make a point saying that he didn't obviously study the whole school and saying that some part jiu-jitsu only and some part lower level. And the question being, if that's the case, then perhaps weapons were not a big thing for him, and he was more interested in the hand-to-hand combat.
Or it can be just a language thing, Japanese language, being very humble,
undermining
position,
himself.
Undermining himself.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, I just did, I just did a bit. Maybe the guy 10
That's
years, and they said, no, I just saw the first kata or something. You don't know.
Well, another consideration, and again, I'm asking you guys as Aikido practitioners, his original students, as I said, it was quite an exclusive group. At least my understanding, it never really became something for the masses until after the war, right? So before and during the war, his group of students were quite, in terms of their social status, they're very high up in military and government, the various professions. I would imagine that many of the students are actually Kendo practitioners as well.
Or sumo.
Sumo as well.
It's possible, but the one we still hear about today, so his best students who spread their own understanding of Aikido later on were mostly Jiu-Jitsu practitioners or Judo. But there's no record of that many swordsmanship within his students.
I thought that he sent some of his students doing Katolishi in Koryu, right?
There are stories about sending his students studying, but
maybe not Kendo,
no,
but Katolishi.
but accepting students that were already high level in probably they had a certain level if 1 million Japanese do Kendo.
Well, for Kendo was fairly omnipresent at the time, and so I would imagine that even if they weren't so-called famous practitioners, they would have had a very strong grounding.
When you mean at the time,
you're right, because Tada Sensei was, I think,
no, he did his own archery thing. When you said the time, what time frame are you actually thinking about?
Definitely the 1930s, 1940s.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, just about everybody in Japan had done Kendo at that stage.
Okay. Because after that, of course, the Deshi would have been like kids.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't have that much experience anyway. So, but before.
Yeah, but since Kendo was kind of mandatory in universities, I think schools, from Churaku.
Yeah.
And I imagine that most of his students had at least like 5, 6, 7 years of sword practice. But we currently have the budo kyoiku, and we had a lot of kids that don't care about what they're doing. They're just doing Kendo, but because they're being told to practice. So in the end, we don't have that much records of very good sportsmen who were practicing Aikido and made something of it afterward, which is a bit odd according to what you're saying, because the chances that some high level, or at least like what we would call today Sandan for that Kendo practitioner came to the dojo is quite high. But
for sure. And it's sort of, I mean, just wondering out loud, but it's like I mentioned before that perhaps in the case of many of his casual students that just sort of came into the circle, maybe many of them, their first ever martial art was Kendo. And like I said, when you pretty much are governed for life by the martial art that you start with, that forms your basis, right? And you can do all these other ones, but you're always going to have that kind of that remnant left in there from if you started with Kendo, then your movement's going to be sort of, without even thinking about it, sort of Kendo centric in a way, just because it's like when you learn to walk, the habit will never disappear completely. So I don't know. I mean, it's something worth looking at, isn't it?
Okay. For what concerns what I know, the only no famous students of Ueshiba who had a strong background in sportsmanship was Kobayashi Hirokaze in Osaka, who had he had a background in karate and many other arts, but he also had a strong background in Kendo, and he continued practicing weapons until the end of his life. But that's the only example I have, and it's very funny because in France, there's a strong group practicing Kobayashi Hirokaze Aikido, and they're very strongly tied with dojo groups, Kendo groups in France, because they have some common or understandings in the sport practice, and they often come to Japan to the Yagyu dojo in Nara. With Kendo practitioners from France and Aikido practitioners, and they come together to the Nara dojo Yagyu. So, but that's kind of the only example I have.
Well, the other thing, of course, is his son-in-law Nakakura Kiyoshi. Is one of the most famous Kendo practitioners of the 20th century, like an absolute legend. I mean, I've never really heard the story about how that came to pass. I mean, do you guys know how?
Well, he was groomed by Ueshiba. He was married to his daughter. He was groomed by Ueshiba to be his successor. But Nakakura decided to go back to Kendo. On all accounts, his proficiency in taijutsu was probably not that high, at least when he came in. So Ueshiba must have assumed that he would pick up the Aikido rather quickly, and most likely because he was already good at Kendo.
But I wonder if the reverse is also true. Maybe a little bit too much to say, but I mean, maybe...
We also don't know if Ueshiba was thinking about a representative role or a technical leading role. And it became both representative and technical with the dojo system, where they assume both positions. But we actually have no idea. And we can have an opinion on the fact that Ueshiba wasn't very fond of the Iemoto system from a technical perspective. So it just ended up to be this way. But
yes. I mean, he proposed to a bunch of people after that. I think Mochizuki was one, Sagawa from Daitoryu was one. Famously interesting. Now, to go back to your point about your friend, eight-dan Kendo, and saying that he was doing Daitoryu, I would be interested to know which Ryuha, because of course, if he was connected to the Tokimune line, they do a lot of Onohai Toryu. It's really merged in their practice. They do Aiki Jujutsu and Onohai Toryu, and that's what they call Aiki Budo. Do you know?
Doesn't Kawakami Sensei do some Daitoryu as well?
Kawakami Sensei?
The eighth-dan Kendo practitioner also is Menkyo Kaiden Onoha.
I couldn't tell you. I don't know about that. And what line of Daitoryu? I couldn't tell you that either with confidence.
Okay.
Especially if it's going to go on YouTube. I have a few ideas.
No, because if that was the case, you'd have your link with the Kendo.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. Interesting.
Okay, Jordy, I actually have a question for you, especially, please, guys, but if you feel you have something. In terms of the weapons that Ueshiba used, it seems that later in his life he's using far thinner Bokken, almost Yagyu style Bokken. What's your impression?
Yeah, actually that's a question I'm asked a lot in my work, because people want to have the Bokken Ueshiba was using at the end of his life. It seems that some of his students say that he was using a very light Bokken, so either Yagyu Bokken or perhaps a Jiki Shinkage, but he wouldn't have known that much about the Jiki Shinkage Bokken because it's the one used for naginata practice, so would have been strange. Probably Yagyu Bokken, and it's consistent with his age, of course, but also with the fact he is moving faster and faster, so faster is easier with lighter Bokken. But I find very strange that at the opposite, the Iwama Bokken, the one used by Saito Sensei student today, is thicker than the standard Bokken. So it's not even a standard one, it's even thicker, and the balance is towards the tip, the Kisaki, and not as centered as it is for a standard Bokken Kendo, which can't be the case for a thin Bokken, which is necessarily balanced and the Tsuka. I find that very inconsistent because, well, I would have to ask you, the swordsman, to what you think of that. But doesn't the balance of the sword has a huge impact on how you use it, and what would happen if you would switch from a fairly heavy Bokken to a very light one? How your practice would change? Alex, you did a bit of Jiki Shinkage, right? With super heavy Bokken.
Kashima Shinden.
Kashima Shinden with the super heavy Bokken.
Yeah. With Kendo itself, the Bokken that we use for kata are the same. Mass-produced, standard length. And they're obviously fairly light. But with koryu, of course, it depends on the school. I think it's easier for me to answer that question not talking about Bokken or Bokuto, but talking about Shinai, which we use in Kendo, the bamboo swords. Because you go through phases. You go through phases where I'm going to use a particularly heavier one. I mean, the rules for Shinai for competition for men, they've got to be 520 grams. Sorry, 510 grams or above. Okay, so half a kilogram, right? But with the shape of the Shinai, it might look the same to everybody. The length is the same, the weight is the same, but every Shinai has a completely different feel to it. And so you get ones that have fatter handles or fatter tsuka. You get ones that are pretty much straight the whole way through with no variation in the thickness. It's just straight. You get Shinai that seem to be top heavy, and you get Shinai that have more weight down towards the hands. And everybody has their own preference for thickness and for the balance. And I've been doing Kendo for 30 years now, and I have a very sort of set ideas on how I want my Shinai to be now, what I feel comfortable with. But I notice that does change over time. Okay, and you go through phases where you try out different things, but then you sort of go back to something that you feel more comfortable with. So it's certainly, they say that you should never blame your tools. Okay, if you're a bad craftsman, bad craftsman always blames his tools for when things don't go well. But with a shinai, it can be a very sensitive thing, and just even a little bit of, the weight feels a little bit top heavy or something like that. It really has a massive effect on your mindset and also the effectiveness of your techniques. A beginner wouldn't notice it at all. But as you get, more refined in your technique, it's those little things that sort of make a huge difference. But like I said, it's not what I would have been using 20 years ago, and what I was using 10 years ago, and what I use now. It really has changed to suit the style of my movement. As you get older, your movement changes, right? You start sort of focusing on different aspects of your kendo, the way that you move, the way that you approach your opponent, the way that you put pressure on them, the kind of techniques that you make your own. And so if Ueshiba changed the use of his bokuto throughout his career, I imagine that's just a purely natural evolution. Which, in kendo we all do. I don't think it's anything mysterious or, if he had some great revelation one day and decided that it's got to be this bokuto. I think it's just a natural progression. As your body changes, your attitude changes, the things that you want to put emphasis on change, then so do the tools that you use, right? So, but one thing I did notice about the bokuto that he was using, it's hard to tell with the photos, but they seem very long, quite long compared to the standard bokuto that you would use in kendo.
I think that's a visual effect because it's a thin one, so it looks longer in comparison to the.
Or maybe he's a really short guy.
Tinier.
And Ueshiba was 153.
Oh, okay.
53.
Wow.
58 after this.
Yeah.
But yeah, if it's a yagyu, it's 101.5, so it's a standard length. If it's a Niwama Bokken, it's 1.5 longer. It's 103.
More thin and long than Niten Ichiryu. They're thin and very long.
Yeah, but the kind of idea of the original Aikido Bokken in Niwama is that's my guess, but I think that they were making their own bokuto at the time,
right.
And that they had very few craftsman skills,
Right.
so they just took sticks.
They got a piece of wood.
Do you know that Bokken that Isayama Sensei showed me in Iwama, that really odd-shaped?
That's the Chinese Bokken. That was probably a present from someone to Ueshiba, and they just kept it in the dojo because this large blade curved the handle.
Yes,
Slightly curved handle. Well, it's a Chinese.
There's another consideration, I don't know, but it just reminds me of something that I was told a few years ago by some old Japanese kendo sensei. And he had this bokuto, which I swear to God, it was made out of balsa wood. It was so light. It was like, obviously you can't actually use it for a kata because it would just break. But he would do suburi with this very, very light bokuto every day before we start training. And it's like, you think, well, if you're going to do suburi, you might use a big heavy one and sort of build yourself up and get your strength. And he says, no. The secret is to learn how to use a really light bokuto as if it was really heavy. Okay, and he was talking about ki at the time, so he gave it to me, and it's like, you do your normal suburi, okay, with this really light one, and every time it sort of moves at the end, and he goes, hold on, too much power, okay, you've got to use your sort of, your ki, your feeling to actually make it a solid strike, but without that excess sort of power in it. And to actually do that with a really light bokuto, to make it seem like it's actually a very heavy, decisive strike was really hard. You know, so I wonder if there's that kind of sort of thought behind it.
But they say in Yagyu, they say it's the lighter the bokuto, the harder it is to control it.
Mm-hmm.
But the balsa stuff, okay, it's probably kiri. It's made like the kiri box.
Right,
it's
right.
made of kiri. And then when you ask the craftsmen, they say it's mostly for tsurugi no mai, or for dancing.
For dancing,
it's not really used in budo. It can be interesting if you have like a broken shoulder or something like that.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you hit it even lightly, it just breaks.
Yeah. But who knows? I mean, who knows what he was thinking about? You know, I mean, whether it was just random or actually he had some kind of thing that. I mean, you find a lot of kendo teachers, older guys, and they're always playing around with certain things and trying to experiment. Like if I can just grab this for example, if it was a shinai, like usually your hands are this far apart when we strike, but I don't know, you get this old guy that I know, he practices with a shinai like this now, which is incredibly uncomfortable as far as I'm concerned, because you want to have that leverage there, right? And he does it like this. Why do you do that? And he goes, well, this is how a real katana was held, with your hands close together. So, I think the use of a weapon, a bokuto, it can become a very personal thing. And so, who knows? I mean, I know a lot of kendo teachers, as I said, who sort of experiment with a lot of, the way they use it, and the ones that they use, if it's a shinai, the weight and the balance and so forth. So I would imagine that Ueshiba would have done exactly the same, I would think.
At the end of the day, it's whether you put any importance on whether it cuts or not.
Yeah.
Because I suspect if you're gonna cut, bamboo or whatever,
there's
not that many ways you can actually do it.
Yeah. No, that's right. And the thing is, it's like looking at his swordsmanship. A die-hard kenjutsu practitioner would say, he's not cutting, it's just bullshit. It's just touching lightly. So I don't think that's the point at all. Even in kendo, it's like when we use a bamboo sword, we strike. We're not actually cutting, but that's not the point. You say it is in theory, and the broader, philosophical aspects of it. Yes, you're up against your opponent, and it's like, you can touch the kiru, uchikiru, cut through. But the reality is that's not what we're doing. But we're trying to hone other things. We're trying to develop other things, and so whether the swordsmanship that he's doing in the video is actually effective, proper swordsmanship, it's not the point.
Yeah.
I think the point is the interaction that he has with his opponent.
And the consistency within his entire system.
Exactly. That's. I mean, you look at kobudo, koryu styles of like kenjutsu. You'll see, like I do, with my jikshin kageryu, we have the hojo kata, and I don't know. You guys are familiar with hojo? Okay.
It's the one where you do the weird stuff like that.
Yeah, it's the weirdest, most esoteric, strange form of swordsmanship.
With the 1 kilogram Bokken.
Yeah,
you're just in pain.
There is absolutely nothing practical about it in terms of if you're, in battle with a sword against an enemy who is attacking you. But that's not the point. It's using a sword to access a different sort of part or philosophy or feeling or spirit or key of swordsmanship that you are developing in a different way. So just to look at something purely of whether it's effective or not is very sort of like one-dimensional, perhaps very superficial in a way, I think.
Well, many kobudo teachers say that there are techniques that are meant to develop the bodies, techniques that are meant to be used in real situation and in a specific context. There are some techniques that are for koryu, breathing, and if a beginner that would just see the techniques from the outside in an embu demonstration would say that's just bullshit, it doesn't work. Yes, but it's no one ever said that this specific technique is supposed to work in the way you imagine it working.
Yeah.
Plus, remember also, just a very light tap with a bokuto can be pretty effective. Doesn't need to. Don't need to cut through the the bone or anything.
Right, and then you're gonna wear an armor or a helmet. You're probably not gonna do the same thing.
I remember in an iaido tournament many years ago that I was participating in. I do a form of iaido called koryu, and koryu is quite distinctive because of hasse, we shout as we cut. So like that, whereas most iaido is quite quiet, right? And you notice that I stopped here when I cut, so many of the cuts in koryu we stop here. Okay, and I remember one geezer came up to me and said, kirete nai, no, dame da, they're saying, it's like he's a drunk old man saying, that's not cutting, you've got to cut straight down to the navel, and stopping here like that, that's not iaido, that's not proper swordsmanship. And it's like, how stupid can you be? Seriously. So the whole idea is go down here like that. Yeah, sure. How long do you think your blade's going to last when you're doing that? And like Baptiste says, just a little knock with a bokto is better. Can you imagine getting a 30-inch razor blade sort of, just even that far down is going to cause you all sorts of bother, isn't it? So there's all these sort of preconceived ideas of what is effective and what is supposed to be real swordsmanship and not. But I sort of, having done a few different kobudo and also kendo, so I don't even look at that as really particularly significant, because when the hell are you going to get out there with a sword and kill somebody anyway?
And then again, that reminds me the Carl Friday essay that you published in the budo anthology that you published.
Oh yeah.
Which is that, and then how much was the sword actually used in battle?
Yeah, I mean that's become quite a standard theory in scholarship these days about the sword was primarily a secondary weapon, as opposed to the first weapon that would be used in battle, because they are sort of quite fragile. And the point that he brings up, which is is an interesting one, is that if that's the case, why did so many of the original ryuha focus specifically on kenjutsu?
Well, that's a status thing. Yeah.
Well, it's a status thing, and you've got to draw a distinction between art and soldiery. So, battle, pitched battle, and an art, there's overlap, but it's not necessarily the same thing. And to think of it as the same thing is going to bring up all sorts of contradictions that, to be honest, you can't really sort of answer a lot of it. But if you think of them as, separate kind of things with a little bit of overlap here, then it all makes perfect sense.
We come back a little to what I said at the beginning. It's not because you are a good budoka that you are a good warrior.
Yeah.
And it was the way around.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's like you were saying about, Ueshiba had a reputation for being a fierce warrior in battle, in the thick of it, and maybe it was because he was really brave and reckless, perhaps, or...
Well, that's kind of my theory. I think he was small and often ill, and
he had a chip on his shoulder,
issues.
I think.
Yeah.
And when he got to the army, it was just like, I need to do my best to be the strongest, and he just faced adversity and tried to be the strongest. But
they wouldn't even take him; he was too short. So it took some work on his part to really get accepted. So.
Since he started from very bottom of it, he had to be reckless and brave, and he had to show some other qualities to convince people. And from there, he did actually take part in perhaps even killing in the battlefield. And from there, he started to really learn budo. But his studies of budo are not do not predate his success on the battlefield, and that's very interesting because it shows this idea that having fought during the war and then studied martial arts, then saw the terrible horrors of the World War II, and then finally getting to some form of pacifism is kind of a very long road that created a kind of a legendary man today. And that's far more interesting than just having this idea of a guy who just trained in budo, was good, did a war, and and then just evolved as a budoka. He evolved as a human being, and that's far more interesting.
It is, and it's a very common story when you think about it. When you think about it, all of the great martial artists throughout history, you know, in Japan, even Miyamoto Musashi is exactly that. You know, how much is truth and how much is, you know, fiction sometimes is very blurred. But I think it's standard understanding that, you know, after he'd been through his 60-odd life or death battles and reached a certain age, he started looking for something a little bit more profound in what he was doing. And the techniques of the sword, even the stuff he was doing, wasn't necessarily that practical, you know, but it was a vehicle to sort of access a sort of a higher plane or a higher understanding of your very short existence, very precarious existence on this earth. And Ueshiba, what you're saying is it was exactly the same. And then, you know, pretty much all of the famous martial artists, you could say the same thing, right? Like Yagyu Munenori, for example, or, you know, all of the greats, Tsukahara Bokken, pretty much this very similar sort of story. They go through a very violent stage and then they live through it and they reach an impasse and probably have a kind of a mental breakdown, perhaps, who knows. And we call it a midlife crisis now.
No, when you read the official story, it's called Satori, not the breakdown.
Yeah, well, yeah. And they have strange dreams and things, right? But and it's sort of like reinventing yourself. I mean, it's just a natural progression.